Well, there you go. Stirling's got a castle. Most folk who visit Stirling will visit the castle. And some will visit the castle and just go away again, head for somewhere else. They don't hang around. Some visitors will perhaps want to see the old bridge, or they may want to go to Cambus Kenneth Abbey, which is quite old. Perhaps on their way to the Wallace Monument, which is oldish, not as old as those other things. As I say, they want to see old things, and they just don't want to hang around and visit Stirling itself. If only they'd ventured further than the castle's esplanade. For the town of Stirling has plenty of old things. Plenty of historical bits and bobs to keep your interest. But in fact, Stirling used to have more old things than it does now. A lot of the housing at the top of the town, round about Broad Street, Baker Street, St Mary's Wynd, etc., was demolished in various stages, 1920s, 1950s. And those old slums were replaced with more modern structures that were clean and clinical, but really not as interesting as the old structures that they replaced. I think the main problem with 20th century housing developments is that while they do sort of blend in with the few remaining old structures, and they do improve living conditions for residents, they also display a certain blandness in appearance. Those old slums might not have had running water or a sound roof, but they had character, something that is all too often lacking in today's housing. So today we're going to have a look mainly at the top of the town in Stirling, but we'll venture a little further, perhaps down into the foot of King Street, to try and determine what exactly it was about old Stirling that made it far prettier than the Stirling of today. Okay, so let's start with this very old photograph by John Muirwood. It dates to the 1840s, the very early days of photography, hence why it's so grainy. But what does it show? Well, on the right-hand side we can see a wall of the Church of the Holyrood, and on the left is a clock tower of the old Tolbooth. The light-coloured building in the centre is no longer there, but can be seen in an 1858 town plan. Clearly, like the church and the Tolbooth, there are some old buildings that are still with us. Indeed, many, if not most, of the most important or architecturally more interesting buildings have survived. In fact, Sir Frank Mears was keen to conserve significant buildings while creating new buildings that were sympathetic to the historic area in which they sat. But at the end of the day, no matter how much architectural sympathy was flying around, there's no getting away from the fact that the general look and feel of the top of the town was changed. Was it changed for the better? To demolish or renovate? That is the question. the architect's dilemma. If we look down Jail Wynd towards the upper part of Broad Street, we can see some buildings that have a bit of age to them. In this 1950s photo, we see the same buildings, clearly in a state of distress at that time. Some of the buildings at the top end of Broad Street do appear to have been renovated, presumably in the 1950s, and today it's probably just external and internal walls of the original buildings that remain. But the general appearance is much the same. This view contrasts with the bottom part of Broad Street, where most buildings towards St Mary's Wynd were demolished in the 1920s. And this is how it used to be, with one small curious boy, the Market Cross, and an intriguing mix of pubs, lodgings and shops, not to mention a boy balancing something on his head. Folk were always balancing things on their head in the old days. This was the old Stirling, the part that no longer exists, the part that, unlike 20th century replacements, is anything but bland. For although the replacement housing looked old, with crow-stepped gables, quaint arched pens and different building styles, it looks nothing like this. It lacks the shops, the businesses and general vibrancy of what was there before. In short, the new Stirling must have been stark, unfamiliar and uninspiring for those who lived there. And in improving the area for those who still remained, the initial slum overcrowding meant many families were moved out to areas like the Raplach. A community had been dispersed and destroyed. That feeling of belonging had gone. Well, that's Darnley Coffee House just behind me, sitting at the foot of Broad Street. Best soup in Scotland. It's a fairly old-looking building, and certainly when you're inside it has an old feel to it. I mean, it's reputed to have been an occasional dwelling place of Lord Darnley and perhaps an occasional nursery of King James VI. I don't think there's any proof for any of that. It's a nice story anyway, but it's certainly an old building that goes back that far. But of course, all is often not as it seems, because that building was renovated in the 1950s. If I say renovated, it was completely gutted. You can see in this photograph the state that it was in then. I think you're talking about total innards removed, and probably all that's left of the original structure is the external and internal walls, which in themselves can dictate how quaint and old a structure feels, even when it has been renovated. But far too much of the housing just at the foot of Broad Street dates, I think, to the 19... Oh, it's a mixture of things. Some of it was rebuilt in the 1920s and some of it in the 1950s. And I think right here is a good example of just what I'm trying to say here as far as changing the character of a town. And as we can see in this photograph dating to around about 1900, you can see how the Darnley Coffee House looked before it was renovated. St Mary's Wynd is another byway that has seen significant changes since the old days. Before improvements took place to demolish buildings and widen the road for the passage of modern vehicles, it was a wynd, a narrow passageway hemmed in by tall old buildings, as we can see in this close-up of a photo of the foot of Broad Street in 1923. You can see the narrow entrance to St Mary's Wynd on the far right. This is another view of the Wynd, again in 1923. An earlier view of around 1900 shows evidence of hardship in the area with the 3 balls of a pawnbroker. It also gives a good look at some of the buildings that were lost. It wasn't just housing that was demolished. The building on the left of the Wynd, with 3 arched windows on the first floor, was a school, as we can see in an Ordnance Survey town plan dating to 1858. Before leaving the top of the town, let's take one last longing look up Broad Street in the old days. We can see the Broad Street Brewery on the left, and the Tolbooth or Town Hall and Police Station in 1905. It's the hustle and bustle of folk getting on with their lives, and not just heading to and from the castle. That mid-19th century town plan tells us that the old butter and poultry market was on the other side of Jail Wynd, and that Broad Street had 3 public houses, in addition to any number of shops and businesses. It's a very different view today. And so we end at the bottom of King Street, and a view along Murray Place around the end of the 19th century, as captured either by James Valentine or the firm Valentine and Sons. There's just so much going on in that photo, probably worth a video all on its own. If we zoom in on the right-hand side, we see any number of shops and hotels. Look at that boot sign above the boot and shoe shop. Probably the biggest difference from the view today is the church in the distance. What a stunning building. That mid-19th century town plan tells us that it was the North Church, and on its left was the Baptist Chapel. Today, in place of those architecturally stunning buildings, we have a concrete extension to the Thistle Shopping Centre and something of an eyesore. If we zoom in on the left of Valentine's photo, we see a rather grand building and a policeman peeking around a corner. An 1896 Ordnance Survey map tells us that it used to be a bank. Again, it's a stunning building, full of carvings and statues and stuff. But something has happened to that building. Before we look at the view today, pay attention to the arch with the statues on the second floor and the carved heads above each arched window on the ground floor. Because today, as we can see, they've gone. The building still looks pretty grand, but what has happened to the statues and the heads? If anyone knows, please drop me a comment. Well, I thought I'd end here and settle in one of Stirling's very old buildings in an absolutely beautiful old pub. You know, it's always going to be a difficult decision whether to renovate or demolish. There are many considerations when making such a decision. How old is that old building? How far has it gone? Can it be saved? Etc. But sadly, on far too many occasions, it is money, or the lack of it, that is an overriding factor in making that decision. What's cheaper, renovation or demolition? And it is this lack of money that has on far too many occasions irreparably changed the face and character of way too many of Scotland's old towns and cities. I'm Eddie Burns. Bye for now.